I think we're in a world right now, if I'm really blunt, we used to often say, well, if the consumer was willing to pay more, I'll change practice. I think what the dairy industry needs to do is figure out how to keep the consumer. We don't, because there are a ton of alternatives out there. We want the consumer to want to buy milk, to buy yogurt. And a lot of that comes down to values.
Welcome to Rumination. Hi, I'm your host, Chris Gwyn, and today I'm pleased to be speaking with Dr. Marina Von Keyserlingk to discuss the topic of cow-calf separation. Nina's love of animals began at a very young age while growing up on a beef cattle ranch in the Okanagan Valley of British Columbia. After leaving the ranch, she went on to complete her Bachelor of Science degree in Agricultural Science at UBC and her Master's of Science degree in Animal Science at the University of Alberta. She returned to UBC to complete her Ph.D. in Animal Sciences in 1995. And after graduating, she worked in a variety of roles in the agricultural business sector before joining the Animal Welfare Program at UBC in 2002 as their third faculty member. The majority of Nina's work has focused on the under-researched areas of behavior, housing, and management, and how these contribute to farm animal welfare. Her work has impacted animal care on farms around the world. She is today the director of the National Farm Animal Health and Welfare Council of Canada and also sits as a scientific advisory on the Danone Global Animal Welfare Council and the A&W National Animal Welfare Council, councils that set out to provide guidance on farm animal welfare standards on farms. Welcome to the show, Nina.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. Animal welfare and perhaps its impacts on health are hot topics in the livestock industry today. Can you please share a bit on how you came interested in these topics?
That's a big question, and a question that started probably in my head, let's say 25 years ago. As you alluded to in the introduction, I did a PhD in animal sciences, and I'm trained initially as an experimentalist and as a ruminant nutritionist. And I worked in the feed industry in a number of roles for over 7 years. And during my time, sort of at the end of my PhD and also working in industry, and coming from a farming background, what I was noticing and what was becoming very evident to me is that society was asking a lot of questions about where their food comes from. We had passed the time where society in general just trusted farmers to do the right thing. And as most people can see, my last name is not a conventional Anglophone name. It's very German. I have strong German roots and had been in Europe a number of times, and animal welfare was a big issue there. And it wasn't necessarily that people wanted to become vegetarian. It was they just wanted assurances that animals had a reasonably good life. And so towards the, after about 6 or 7 years of industry where I had done a lot of work on all on the nutrition side, how to make cows milk more, how many grams of amino acid are we going to feed these high producing cows? And I also done a lot of poultry work, both on the egg side and on the broiler side. And, on the broiler side, we were talking about trying to, how many days from setting the chick to slaughter, how much could we reduce that, from 42 days down to 37 days to, now people are talking about even shorter than that. And, sows in gestation stalls and in good, when I self-reflected on that, I thought, how do I defend this? How do I defend some of these practices? Putting a sow in a gestation stall for, a good portion of her gestation while she's gestating, that can't be a good life. But I didn't have any training. I didn't really know what, I didn't even know. I remember the first time talking to my colleague, David Fraser, who has just retired, about telling him he wanted me to apply for this job. And I said to David, I don't even know what animal welfare is. And he drew a drawing, a Venn diagram of sort of, it encompasses health, which is really important. And we've been worried about health in agriculture for a long time, natural behavior, and this emotional state of the animals, and trying to find solutions that work for farmers, but also cover off all of these aspects of what impacts an animal's life. And David said to me, Nina, you growing up in agriculture are going to be able to walk into rooms, with beef ranchers and dairy farmers and be able to sit down where for many of us, it's hard to even get in those rooms. You grew up in that industry. And that's sort of where I started and how I got interested in this. And that was over 20 years ago.
Awesome. A strong agricultural base, practical base, but then asking the questions that we all often ask ourselves. And so that makes a lot of sense. So reflecting today on how do you think typical rearing practices can be modified to maximize the amount of, we want to talk more specifically about cow-calf separation, which I think is a work that you've done and seems to be a growing topic of discussion, right? There you go.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, very much so.
Talk to me about how do we modify to maximize the amount of time the cow and calf spend together, if that's what we're trying to do, and also to be realistic about the management procedures that a producer can or will implement at the farm level.
So I'm going to start a little bit further back than just that question. Is why are we even talking about cow calf separation?
Good.
And 10 years ago, I remember trying to apply for some money from the dairy industries and basically told go away. We're not talking about it because there's still many in agriculture, and then my dad was like that. If you don't talk about it, nobody else will, and then therefore I don't have to worry about it. And again, I think back to one of the things that I do a lot is from an environmental perspective, not such a great idea, but I try to reduce my environmental footprint by riding an e-bike, is I spend an awful lot of time in an airplane traveling around the world. And over the last decade, things have started to move in Europe. And in Europe, there are an awful lot. I mean, it's probably one of the hottest research topics in Europe right now is cow-calf contact work. And what does this mean and how does it happen? And when you look at, and I've spent an awful lot of time on farms, like just over a year ago, I think I was on 6 or 7 different cow-calf contact farms in Sweden. I've been on some in the Netherlands and in Germany. And farmers are doing it for different reasons. But generally speaking, what's happening is that society is starting to ask questions. And society's question, when people see dairy, they see a situation where, or they hear about the fact that the calf is taken away. We provide assurances that the calf's going to be fine and the cow is going to be fine. This is the best thing for it. And that's sort of the argument that we've always used, that we as the dairy industry know what's best. But the reality is that we fall short on what's best, because when you look at, we did 2 what we call systematic reviews of the literature. We published these in 2019, and we published them because Dairy Australia had been under quite a bit of criticism about cow-calf separation from the animal rights movements. There was billboards everywhere. And, I've been in those, I was in Australia earlier this year and, talking to those individuals who commissioned that work at that time, that they thought, well, we'll just ask these, in this case, it was my colleague Dan Weary and I, we'll just ask these 2 dairy cattle welfare scientists to write these reviews, and then we can say, here's the scientific evidence as to why we separate. We publish those reviews, and Chris, don't ask me to give you the scientific evidence to justify separation, because I can't give it to you. Generally, when we weigh all of the evidence on the health side, and also on sort of the welfare, behavior, production side, I can't give you strong evidence to justify the practice. So for instance, calf health, we say we do this because it's better for the calves, but what is the mortality rate of dairy calves in North America? We're We applaud when we can get it lower than sort of 6 or 7%. The beef industry would go broke if they had mortality rates at that. So there's a lot of examples like that. Mastitis rates. Mastitis, keeping cows and calves together is highly protective for mastitis. What's one of the biggest economic costs for farmers is mastitis. So we have this situation where we don't have a lot of scientific evidence to justify the practice, but what we do have is 100 years of tradition. We've just always done it this way. And so now what's happening is you've got these farmers who are, there's in every situation, there's these entrepreneurs, these farmers that go out and try something different. And they do it for very different reasons. In the Netherlands, they're doing it. There's a big growth in the cow-calf contact farming way because the Netherlands has proportional representation in their legislation, and they have people who are elected representing animal rights movements. So the conversation is always, at the front end in the political arena. In Sweden, there's a bunch of farmers that are doing it because they married or they've got a partner who doesn't come from the city, come from the country, who comes from the city, who's like, what do you do? And so but the challenge that these people have, these entrepreneurs, is that they're doing these practices in the absence of any guidance because science, we left them behind. Because industry, and in North America, much of dairy research is funded by industry. Industry has said, no way am I funding anything like that. So we're in this situation now where the number of farms is increasing exponentially in many parts of Europe. And now we're seeing this downstream effect. Anything that happens in Europe on the animal welfare front, it's not a question of if it will become part of the conversation in North America, it's just a matter of when. And so, there's a farmer in Southern Ontario that are keeping cows and calves together. I've talked to veterinarians in Quebec who are working with farmers that are trying to do this. Is it all working really well? Some things work well, some things are a disaster. And that's where I think, I'm not somebody who says that cow-calf contact will be mainstream tomorrow. What we need to do as an industry is invest in research. You need people like me to be 10 or 15 or 20 years ahead of the problem. Because then I can, provide evidence. I can make mistakes. I still get paid by this institution, right? Even if it's a disaster. But a farmer doesn't have that luxury. Where science can help farmers is provide some guidance as to, if you're going to move to that system, this is what we recommend that you do. And just to give an example of the power of embracing, obviously I'm super biased because I am a scientist, but in 2002, when I started here, we were doing an awful lot of work on feeding calves more milk. And people thought we were crazy. There was journals that were rejecting papers because they didn't think a calf could drink 8 or 10 liters of milk a day, that this must have been fabricated research. And so now we just passed in Canada, we have the National Farm Animal Care Code, the Code of Practice, and the dairy has just come out with its second revision. And in the code that was published in 2023, it says calves must be fed a minimum of 20% of body weight of milk. The first studies we did were in 2002. We're 20 years that we did research on feeding calves more milk. And others in Europe, like Margit Bak-Jansen in Denmark, and she's retired now, but Katarina Svensson, in looking at the health issues, a lot of commercial epidemiological work on feeding calves more milk. Sandra Godden's done more work on this. So we've got this collection of evidence that when you put it all together, I can now go to a farmer and say, look, here is a recipe. It's probably not going to be perfect, but it's going to get you started. And then the next thing was social housing. And we haven't adopted that carte blanche as an industry, but the science is coming together to help reduce the risk that the farmers are going to fail. So on the issue of cow-calf contact, we just don't have the science. So we need to start doing that work now.
So do we have any hints of what can successfully work on a dairy?
I mean, it's a lot of it is anecdotal. There is, I would say the questions are actually a lot more, how do we say, fundamental than that. Like, for the instance, how long? Nobody really knows. There's a woman in Sigrid, Dr. Sigrid Agnius. She's actually a milk quality expert in Sweden that I spent some time with last year, who's probably got the largest data set that I know of in a more controlled setting, although she's done, I think, almost 125 or 150 cow-calf pairs through a cow-calf contact system. She did them in groups of 25. The challenge she had is she didn't know what the system should be. And so every 25 cows, they tweaked something. And so it's a lot of it is going to be descriptive, and I remember being on a veterinary talk online during COVID with her, where she used 4 months. And I remember asking her the question. I mean, she and I had the conversation beforehand, but I wanted the veterinarians to understand it where we're starting with this was, Sigrid, why 4 months? Why not 3 months? Why not 8 weeks? And she said, look, I had to pick a number because the only thing we know is from the beef industry, where we keep them together for 6 or 7 or 8 months, which is closer to when they would wean naturally. And I had to pick a number. We picked 4 months. Is 4 months right? I don't know. A lot of farmers, and again, there's been no research really looking at this, is in practice, in conventional, traditional practices now, we keep calves on milk for 8 or 10, 12 weeks. We do that in large part for the wrong reason. And what I mean by that, we do that because the greatest risk to mortality and morbidity for that baby calf is when it's on the milk. And so we want to get them off milk as fast as possible, because then they're much less likely to die. And so, but that number 8, 10 exists. And so a lot of farms that I've been on are using that 8 or 10 weeks. What is the biggest challenge in a separated system, when we're taking calves off or when we're feeding them high volumes of milk and we want to wean them? Biggest challenge we have is weaning them, because at 8 weeks, these calves in nature would still be highly reliant on milk. And so that's one of the first big questions that I think we need to address in science, is how long should they be on? And once we do wean them, how do we wean them? Because anything abrupt is a disaster. Of course, this is going to come at a cost to milk, because the calf is going to drink some. So, is there ways that we can manage these calves where we actually train them to also drink from an automatic milk feeder? These are all researchable questions. These all need to be figured out. And what about half-day versus full-day contact? All of that, there's a few studies that are now coming out, but we don't have enough. I don't have 20 years of research to coalesce it all, bring it all together to give guidance.
So we don't really know what the system really looks like, right?
No.
We're talking about contact. As you say, it could be full day, half day, it could be partial day, it could be through a window, could be in the same pen. I mean, this is all the stuff that we don't know, and probably the stuff that maybe scares us a bit in production.
Exactly.
Right.
And it scares us because, at least here in North America, let's just take Canada, for instance, we still have 70% of our farms are tie stall. How would this ever work in a tie stall? I mean, we are transitioning out of that. I would not invest in cow-calf contact work in a tie stall facility right now. But what about a free stall? What about a compost barn? and then you go to the US, and then it's got to be scalable.
Yeah,
I
100%.
was
It's
on a
got to be
farm
scalable.
in New Mexico, with 25,000 cows. How would this even work? But I think that, I guess I look at it, change is scary, but change also brings opportunity. And, I remember being in the UK once, and this is just before COVID, and I gave a talk on, it's the number one talk I get asked to do these days is on this topic. And it was at a conference in the UK, and there was like, I don't know, 1,000 farmers in the room. And a farmer got up and yelled at me because he was so threatened by this conversation about cow-calf contact. And, and I get it. I understand how difficult it is for farmers because change is really hard and it's super scary. And especially, in those markets where they don't have supply management. So they're also, worried about how they're going to pay, anything, buy groceries for their family next week. And I remember saying to him, I said, look, I want everybody in the room to sit back and think. How many of you are on a farm that in the last 50 to 70 years was probably a tie stall facility? And of course, the majority of the people put up their hand. And I said, what do you think your grandfather, whoever was farming at that time, if they had been in this room and I were to have to tell them that in 50 years, a whole bunch of you are not even going to have a milk parlor. Your cows are going to go to some sort of machine that has this electronic arm that's going to milk the cow whenever she wants to be milked in the middle of the night, and you're not even going to be there. And another farmer said, I would have yelled at you. And I said, yes, you would have yelled at me because we can't imagine that world. They couldn't imagine that world then. But the dairy industry has, for 100 years, evolved. And this is just potentially another step in that evolution. Are we going to get there tomorrow? No. Are some entrepreneurial farmers going to get there, are going to try it out next week? Yes. I think there's a lot we can learn from those, not just in Canada and in the United States, but also globally. And in 30 years or 40 years, we may look back and say, that time when we separate them, not sure why we did it, but we don't do it now.
No, it's a key point. Is the industry has changed a lot over the years, and at
Yeah,
each time we doubted whether we could do it, and we're likely, in the most cases, in a better spot. So that
exactly.
brings us to, and you mentioned it earlier, talking about the research. And so, just for a few minutes as we start to wind down this great conversation, where do you see what are the deep holes in research that are needed over the next 5 to 10 years to help the dairy industry understand this and to find practical solutions for that cow calf
So
contact requirement?
yeah, I think it's an exciting time in that area because it's almost a blank slate. um, I think, as I said earlier, I think issues are going to be how long. What does contact mean? And I just finished writing a paper with Nigel Cook from Wisconsin on this perspective that will be published, likely published in the Journal of Dairy Science, and where we talk about the evolution of change, and we also list a bunch of areas where research is needed. And this issue of let me just back up. One of the things that Nigel asked me to co-author this paper, and he said, I'm going to write a paper about cow. They asked me to write a paper about cow-calf separation. Will you co-author it with me? And I said, well, I'll co-author with you. I'll be a co-author, but we're not going to talk about cow-calf separation. We're going to talk about prolonged cow-calf contact, because that's really where the question is. And what does contact mean? Is it through the fence? Is it, where they're totally drinking from another milk source, and the cow gets to lick her and do all those things? Maybe, if I only had $100 to spend on research, I wouldn't put it there,
Okay.
because I think it's the public
Just not
The
interested.
public's not going to accept it.
Yeah.
We need to figure out how, this is my thing. I think the evidence is such that we need to figure out how to make cow-calf contact work. Of course, I think it's going to be socially acceptable. Now we have to figure out how to make it economically viable.
So sorry, I
And
interrupted you because you were talking about this
yeah,
paper with Nigel Cook, and I think that was an important point that
yeah,
you wanted to make. So feel free
yeah.
to.
No, so the nurse cow. So we talk about that in that paper with Nigel. Is that I also say in that paper that I don't think nurse cows are the future. However, what does contact mean? How long is contact? What are some of the benefits of contact? So the Europeans now are just they're going to come out with new legislation, and they are recommending at least 24 hours of contact, which from a cow's perspective can be very negative, because if you allow the bond to establish, then you're breaking it. So there's welfare concerns with that. They're making that recommendation based on benefits to the calf. So increased circulation, that there seems to be benefits in terms of IG. And I mean, I'm not totally familiar with all that research, but these are sort of the questions that need to be asked. I think in terms of contact or duration of contact, regardless of whether or not it's half day or full day or a whatever version of partial day, we also need to think about what stage that calf is developmentally. And so we know that high volumes of milk does delay starter intake, because in nature, those cows would not be consuming a lot of starter before they were sort of 4 or 5 weeks of age. I don't think 4 weeks is going to be, I think 4 weeks is too early. Is 8 weeks going to work? Not sure. 12 weeks? Not sure. And then there's the issue, because all of this is going to come together in the near future, is what about those male calves? What about the female calves? Are we going to treat them differently? And the more cow-calf contact, or the fact that we separate, becomes part of the public discussion, which, Chris, it will, because of social media, because of all these things, I'm not sure we're going to be able to defend, well, we do it for the females, but we don't do it for the males.
Wow, I hadn't even thought of that. Yeah, that's a big question. Wow.
So these are all things that
Yeah.
are churning around, and these are what we call these are complex problems, very complex. And the way we've tended to answer questions in dairy science or animal science is we're very good at technical solutions. We tweak something, like back to the nutrition world, we add a little bit or we take a little bit away, and do we get a growth response, or do we get a milk production response? A lot of these questions around cow-calf separation, around surplus calf issues, these are not going to be solved with technical solutions. These are super complex. This is going to require transformational change in how we dairy, because I'm not sure we could do this in a freestall barn. And what is this going to look like?
Okay. Yeah, that's some
Yeah.
big questions, and it helps us understand where maybe the research needs to head. Lots to do. Tell me about some of the take-home messages you'd like to leave with them talking about cow-calf contact and what needs to be considered moving forward.
So I think the number one message is, don't be afraid of the conversation. Don't for sure, don't think that we can educate our way out of this conversation. Because that's often what agriculture does, is, we just need to educate society. We need to educate the consumer. If they understood why we separate, then they will believe us and support us doing that practice. We got to let that go. I think we're in a world right now, if I'm really blunt, we used to often say, well, if the consumer was willing to pay more, I'll change practice. I think what the dairy industry needs to do is figure out how to keep the consumer. We don't, because there are a ton of alternatives out there. We want the consumer to want to buy milk, to buy yogurt. And a lot of that comes down to values. Of course, price also matters, but values also matter. There's many households in this country have more than just milk in their fridge. because they've got a 13 or a 15 or a 16-year-old teenager who's now decided for whatever, they're going to not drink dairy or not do this or not do that. And so we need to really think about, how do we slowly, I don't think the thoughtful person on the street expects the dairy industry to change overnight, but how do we evolve that we maintain trust, and trust from the consumer in how we do business? And a lot of that trust is based on practices that resonate with societal values. And if we continue to uphold practices that are traditional from 100 years ago that don't resonate with societal values, we risk losing public trust. And cow-calf contact is going to be a big conversation going down, because you are messing with that maternal offspring bond, and for many people in the public eye, that is something that is they cherish. So that would be my take-home message. My other take-home message, just one other one, is I truly believe that the thoughtful person on the street doesn't expect us to change overnight, but they expect us to get better every day. And those are two very different things.
Nina, thank you very much for sharing and to meet and discuss with you today on this topic. It's important, and it's important to be aware and to, as you say, your key take-homes, and to, really good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And I really want to thank our audience for listening to us today. And I'll remind you that you can subscribe to our channel at jefo.ca, and so that you don't miss the next or past episodes of the Jefo Rumination Podcast. You can find us at jefo.ca, at Apple and Google Podcast, as well as Spotify. This podcast was brought to you by Jefo Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world. And have a great day.